the designs of Palladio and the Ottoman buildings in Istanbul have many interesting points in common, especially the creation of big domes in the cityscape and creating a silhouette with prominent domes that are on the waterfront, and this kind of dialogue between the city and the buildings is an interesting point in common. And this brings into mind that both Istanbul and Venice can be considered sister cities because they both shared a Byzantine heritage, but also in this time in the 16th century, which is the age of Sinan and Palladio, they both also began to be interested in the common Roman heritage of these cities. So for me, these parallels are interesting and important. One could share also a knowledge of Vitruvius, having very common traditions of engineering, such as construction of water drainage and aqueducts, bridges. These are very much part of the common traditions, but also one should point out the construction of ships. This was a great element of kind of spying between Venice and Istanbul, and especially in Istanbul, because the houses were mostly of wood. Construction of ships and vernacular architecture shares a lot, which makes the monumental architecture of Sinan in terms of the mosques and madrasas stand out across from a frame of wooden houses that were painted in a colorful fashion, which differs a little bit from Venice. So from this one might turn to the question of whether Sinan and Palladio were aware of each other, which is a question that has interested many scholars internationally. On one aspect, we can't completely be sure because there is no written documentation. But we can't have written documentation for everything, so you have to imagine what were the possible contacts that are likely. And after having studied this subject, both from the Italian point of view and from the Ottoman point of view, I think I can make some reasonable predictions and judgments, because after all, before I started studying Ottoman architecture and Islamic architecture, in the States, my undergraduate degree was in Italian Renaissance, and that's how I became interested in other parts of the Mediterranean. I would say that many of the sources we have in the Venetian archives, where I have studied, and also in the Ottoman archives, are official documents. And sometimes there are travelers, but mostly the relazioni are meant to be read in the Senate, so they weren't always explaining what kinds of contacts these visitors from Italy had with artists and architects. Likewise, many of the ambassadors who went to Italy, particularly Venice, but there were also important relations with Vicenza. For example, one of the very important courtiers of the late 15th century, Angiolello, was from Vicenza, and he was in the time of Mehmed II in the finance department of the state, so he was always in contact with different kinds of people. In this period, the chancellery documents of the Ottoman Empire are written in multiple languages: Italian, Latin, Greek. And when they wrote to Islamic courts, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. This changed at the time of Andrea Gritti when Süleyman the Magnificent, and he had important relations, but all of a sudden the Ottoman documents became purely Ottoman and multilingualism stopped. So Sinan and Palladio are belonging to this period when it seems that officially there are clearer divisions of identity. However, when we look at the individuals who went back and forth, they were the ones who possibly carried the information, and it's been shown that, for example, Marc Antonio Barbaro was very much present at that time, and he described many of Sinan's buildings and even went to some of the building sites where he would surely have met Sinan. But also for the Italians, one important point was to look at what are the grand admirals doing. And many of these building sites, when the Navy was not in war in the Mediterranean, were actually building supervisors. So many of the relationships between the Navy and Sinan and construction industry, I think they were very closely watching, which is why I did some research in Venice, because in these official documents, you always get information about what is being built, and also when a building was completed, many gifts were ordered by the friends of the patrons. So Murano glass lamps and all kinds of decorations for the mosques were ordered. So I think these kinds of interactions suggest to me that also Sinan would have been aware of what's going on at that time in Italy. Also because we have, I found some drawings of baths that were done for the Habsburg ambassadors. So it shows that these Habsburgs in the 1570s went to Sinan's, either himself or one of his assistants, and asked for ground plans to be done. And the inscriptions are in Turkish, explaining what are the different rooms of a bath. And then there's a copy done by a German architect with German translations. So these details suggest to me that there are many more relations than the official documents talk about.